Good morning. Hey, Carson. It's Mary Thomas. How are you?
Hey, Mary. I'm doing well.
Oh, well, that's good. You all ready for this?
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Do you have the slide to put up? Are you the producer? You're the producer in this session, correct?
No, Grant is. He can throw it up. Grant, can you throw that slide up, please?
Yeah.
And I believe, did Carson tell you he wants to go last?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm on.
Yeah,
I was switching to
Carson
my
wants to go
brother's
last.
PC.
Everybody else is pre-recorded.
Okay. Yeah. So that means we'll start it off with Amanda Burrows' presentation. Is that how we'll do it, or will you introduce her and everything?
Play all three of those, and then Carson
Okay.
will go last and go straight into Q&A.
Okay.
All right. I'll see y'all later. Looks like we've got everything covered here.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Okay. So Carson, you're going last, and I'm sharing your PowerPoint. Is that correct?
Hey, Grant. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, can you turn on the slide for this session?
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amanda Burrows, and I'm a graduate student in the Department of Sociology at Virginia Tech. And today I'll be talking to you about my project entitled #Blue Wave, Liberal Paternalism in the 2020 Kentucky Senate Election. So a little bit of background on this topic and why I did this project. Political discourse online has been intense, to say the least, over the past 5 to 10 years, and it's only getting more intense. If you've spent any time on Twitter, then you may have noticed that when major events happen in states like Kentucky, which I focus on in this project, or states like Texas, which we've seen more recently, there is a lot of outrage from people who live other places in the United States, and they direct that outrage not just to the political leaders who make the decisions that lead to these events, but they seem to focus their outrage on the people living in these states. And this has always been really upsetting to me. My family's from Owsley County, Kentucky, and I see these horrible memes that put the blame on people living in these states rather than the people in charge. This meme that says boycott Kentucky, I saw this circulating after Mitch McConnell blocked the increased stimulus check at the end of 2020. And it went along with tweets insinuating that bad things would happen to outsiders who stopped at gas stations in Kentucky. So you may as well just boycott the entire state. And then this other meme is shared not to raise awareness of social problems in Owsley County, Kentucky, but rather as a sort of gotcha, like they deserve what they get because they vote Republican. So for this project, I focused on the Kentucky Senate race in 2020. This was a really interesting election season to me, primarily because of the donations the candidates received from people outside of Kentucky. So Charles Booker, of course, ended up losing to Amy McGrath in the Democratic primary, but he had a lot of support from actual Kentuckians, whereas Amy McGrath had an immense amount of support from people outside of the state and not so much from inside the state. And Mitch McConnell, of course, has a ton of support as well from other states. And here is a graph of the donations that Amy McGrath and Mitch McConnell received in state versus out of state. This is taken from a website that tracks donations and demographics. And this data is from right before the election. So as you can see, Amy McGrath at this point had received almost $60 million in donations from people outside of Kentucky. Mitch McConnell, about half that. And then the amount of money that they received from in-state just pales in comparison to the out-of-state donations that they got. So my methodology for this project was to do a content analysis of tweets. What I was really looking for were themes of paternalism and mockery. And I didn't have to look for it. It jumped out immediately. What I was really interested in was people from outside of Kentucky, their sort of father knows best mentality directed towards people living in Kentucky. This sort of, I can't understand why you would vote for Mitch McConnell when your state does so horribly in education and health outcomes, et cetera. And I was interested in trying to understand why people who have never set foot in Kentucky feel like they understand Kentucky's problems more than the people who live there. And like I said, I was also looking for instances of mockery that honestly was very emotionally difficult for me because some of it is really nasty and is perhaps more difficult to deal with coming from people who are supposed to be more politically aligned with myself. You know, it's one thing to hear these really disturbing things come from the other side of the aisle, but to come from people who are supposed to be more centered around social justice, it's difficult. And I also tried to identify users' political ideologies, their geographical locations, and some other identifying factors such as gender and race. Now that wasn't always possible. So I have this example here. I can't identify this person's race. I could guess their gender based on their name, but I also didn't, that wasn't the main focus of this project. So I didn't, consider that too much. I just made a note of it if I could guess. And also, as you can see in this person's bio, they don't have their location. Some people do have that on Twitter. When they didn't have their location, I had to use kind of context clues to figure out whether they were from Kentucky or not. And even if I couldn't tell exactly where they lived, I could usually tell whether they were from Kentucky or not. And then it was also pretty easy to gather people's political ideologies. Again, using this example with things like, I believe in LGBTQ rights, Black Lives Matter, the environment, healthcare for all, that sort of thing in a bio tells me that they're on the left to some extent. Having Biden and Harris in the profile picture tells me that they're probably a Democrat and not, for example, a leftist. And then this tweet from the same user references why do people vote against their own best interests, which is one of the main things that I searched for. So I did 8 searches. I did Kentuckians plus McGrath before and after the election, Kentuckians plus McConnell before and after the election, and Kentuckians plus Booker before and after the election. And then I did vote against own interest plus Kentucky before and after the election. So some of the key findings that I had were that for Kentuckians plus McGrath, almost all of the users were from outside of Kentucky. And I gathered every 5th tweet for every 200 tweets for each of these searches. And it turned out that for McGrath plus Kentuckians before the election, 95% of those tweets were pro-McGrath. Whereas when I did the same search, but with McConnell, they were not pro-McConnell, they were pro-McGrath and anti-McConnell. Whereas the same search with Booker had very different results. Almost every tweet was from inside Kentucky this time. And instead of having the persona that you can see here, where the politics are very important to their identity, it seems, Booker tweets were more just one part of a person's Twitter experience. And they were mostly explaining that they thought Booker would do a better job at McGrath than beating McConnell. And of course, that was before the election, so we didn't know what the results were going to be. And then tweets after the election changed pretty significantly in some cases. So Kentuckians plus McGrath after the election went from 85% of people being from outside of Kentucky to 40% of people being outside of Kentucky. And 40% of the tweets were critical of McGrath. And then the same search with Booker showed that people, again, were arguing that had Booker beaten McGrath, then Booker would have had a better chance of beating McConnell. And the searches for Kentuckians plus McConnell after the election were pretty similar to from before the election, except that they questioned the validity of the election. There was a lot of sort of Trump supporter-esque tweets, except they were coming from the left, questioning the validity of the election outcomes because they just couldn't believe that Kentuckians would vote for McConnell again. And 75% of those tweets called Kentuckians stupid or uneducated. As far as the key term vote against their own interests, over 30% of those tweets referred to Kentuckians as stupid or uneducated, and they all came from people living outside of Kentucky. So across all of my searches, only 5 Trump supporters were identified. Of course, that's not to say that more of them didn't vote for Trump, but just based on what I could tell from the identity that they put out there online, only 5 of them seemed to be Trump supporters. Again, Booker supporters had fewer political identifiers in their bios than McGrath supporters. And honestly, the tweets from liberals outside of Kentucky were shockingly mean. And like I mentioned before, very upsetting. This person, says, has there ever been a group of poor, uneducated people who continually vote against their best interests so often? Really hateful stuff coming from liberals about Kentuckians. So here, I didn't censor these users' names since they're blue checks and famous, but this is another example of liberals assuming that they know better than Kentuckians. George Takei saying, I'm tempted to move to Kentucky just to run against Mitch McConnell, as if George Takei has any idea what it's like, what the social problems in Kentucky are like. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this isn't a problem that's unique to Kentucky. We saw with Texas with the winter storms that a lot of liberals online were saying that the people suffering in Texas deserved it because they voted Republican. And unfortunately, this comes up every time something like that happens. with the flooding in Eastern Kentucky that just happened, I saw it again, people saying, well, that's what you get for voting for Mitch McConnell. This, as I've said a few times now, this project was really difficult for me to do because it's tough to see people talk about, you know, people in general that way. It's really difficult. But I suppose the silver lining is that I did identify this as a trend, as a problem, and I hope that people like myself and those of you listening can use your platforms to try to bring awareness to people and to try to educate some of the liberal people that feel like people living in these communities deserve what they get, and to try to explain humanity to them. Unfortunately, that's what we have to do. So thank you so much for your time.
My name is Nathan Vanderford. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Toxicology and Cancer Biology in the College of Medicine at the University of Kentucky, and I'm also a faculty affiliate of the university's Appalachian Center. I'm also the director of the Appalachian Career Training and Oncology Program, or ACTION program for short, at the Markey Cancer Center at the university. Today, I'll be presenting work we've done recently in which we have used storytelling to empower Appalachian Kentucky youth to understand and address cancer disparities in their communities. We've analyzed these stories to identify themes associated with the high cancer rates in Appalachian Kentucky, and I'm very happy to be here today to present this work. I'd like to thank the organizing committee for the opportunity to present, and I look forward to your questions and discussion after all the presentations in this session. Before fully getting started and in full transparency, I'm an Appalachian native by birth and upbringing, so I have deeply rooted personal experiences with cancer, its impact, and its causes in Appalachia. That said, my team and I worked very hard to try to not influence our storytellers' narratives. I have no financial conflicts to disclose. So what do I hope that you'll learn in the next few minutes? Well, after this presentation, I hope that you'll be able to identify the following three things. First, I hope you'll be able to identify that Kentucky ranks first in the nation in overall cancer incidence and mortality rates, with the greatest burden of the disease being in the Appalachian region of the state. Second, I hope you'll be able to describe some of the key social determinants of health that drive Kentucky's cancer disparities. And third, I hope that you'll be able to recognize that storytelling can be an important method for individuals to conceptualize and communicate the burden of cancer around them, as well as to envision possible culturally tailored interventions. Okay, as I just mentioned, Kentucky has the highest cancer incidence and mortality rates in the United States. This is critically important. No other state in the country has a worse cancer problem than does Kentucky. There are over 26,000 new cases and 10,000 deaths each year in the state. What's worse is that cancer rates are greatest in the Appalachian region of Kentucky. And in fact, Appalachian residents are about 8% more likely to die from a preventable or screenable cancer than are their non-Appalachian counterparts. Kentucky's cancer disparities are driven by key social determinants of health. Appalachian Kentucky has high poverty rates, which is what this map speaks to. The shaded counties are those in Appalachia. The region spans a 13-state area in the eastern part of the United States that stretches from southern New York to northern Mississippi. The red shaded counties you see here in this map are those that have distressed economic levels, and you see that there's a concentration of those counties in eastern Kentucky. This highlights the poverty in Appalachian Kentucky, especially compared to the rest of the region. You can overlay this map with other social determinants of health, including poor health behaviors that include smoking and behaviors that lead to obesity and chronic infections, barriers to healthcare access and engagement, and low education levels, as well as other social determinants. Ultimately, all these things create the perfect storm that contributes to the high rates of cancer in the area. Additionally, while Appalachia has a beautiful culture that contributes to the vitality of its people, many of the cultural practices also contribute to the high rates of cancer in the area. I've highlighted some of those key cultural features of Appalachia here. The culture includes very rich traditions, including positives such as storytelling that I'm telling you about today, and unfortunately many negatives, including the use of tobacco. Strong family and faith connections, the latter of which can lead to fatalistic views, which can have negative influences on health-related practices. The people, the residents of the area, are fiercely independent and self-sufficient, which can lead to poor health-seeking practices. Residents typically engage in and value hard manual work, which can lead to harmful exposures. Education is not valued, which can lead to poor health behaviors and risky behaviors. And there's a celebration of the tobacco and coal industry, which can also lead to poor health behaviors and risky behaviors. In terms of our storytelling exercise that I'm going to be telling you about today, these are aspects, these cultural features are aspects of our participants' cultural realities that were major backdrops and centerpieces of their stories. Now, who told the stories that we've analyzed and I'm going to tell you a little bit about today? Our storytellers were participants in the Appalachian Career Training and Oncology Program, or ACTION program for short. This program prepares participants to pursue cancer careers by getting them involved in cancer research, cancer education, clinical shadowing, and community outreach activities. Particularly important for today's talk is that through our outreach activities, we aim to train our participants to be change agents in their families and in their communities by them sharing cancer awareness and cancer information, which can increase individuals' cancer literacy. We believe that the program and our participants can serve as a means of reducing the cancer and education disparities in Appalachian Kentucky. It's part of the education and outreach components of the ACTION program that I engaged 25 of the ACTION participants in this cancer storytelling exercise. And by storytelling here, I mean that I had participants write culturally framed essays describing their experiences with and perspectives on cancer. And I'll tell you more about that in just a bit. This is really powerful. Storytelling is very powerful because stories can really speak to the personal impact more so than can data alone. Clearly, cancer statistics, cancer epidemiology, cancer surveillance are all critically important for us to understand the general prevalence and impact of cancer as a disease, for example. But it's personal stories of cancer that can really shed more detailed personal information and personal context on the personal impact of the disease. As a side note, since writing these essays, we've now published them together as a book titled The Cancer Crisis in Appalachia, Kentucky Students Take Action. We're now using this book as a community outreach and engagement tool to influence the region's understanding of cancer in general and its impact on people in the region. Okay, so what did we do and how did we do it? As I said, 25 ACTION participants wrote essays that focus on each writer's experiences with cancer, why they think cancer rates are so high in their families and their communities, and what they think can be done to address the high rates. After we published the book, we've now gone back and used content analysis to identify common themes in the essays regarding the types of cancer our participants have observed, their feelings toward the causes of cancer in Appalachian Kentucky, and their proposed solutions that could ultimately potentially lower cancer rates in the area. In the analysis, we found that our participants observed high occurrences of such cancers as breast, lung, prostate, and skin, which are all cancers known to be elevated in Appalachian Kentucky. This graph shows you the number of occurrences of each of the listed cancer types across the 25 essays. And you can see that there's a range of cancer types that our participants referenced and have thus experienced in some way. In terms of common themes across the essays, our participants conceptualized that many circumstances and cultural practices of the region influence the high cancer rates in their communities and in their families. These include aspects of the region's geography that can influence healthcare access, the tobacco culture, low education levels that can contribute to poor health behaviors, environmental issues, including exposure to coal mining contaminants and improper waste disposal and subsequent exposures, poverty leading to access to care issues and food availability or food access issues, poor prevention practices that can include access to care and care engagement issues, and mistrust of outsiders, which includes mistrust of healthcare professionals. Ultimately, sometimes Appalachians just don't trust those that are not from the area. This graph highlights the occurrences of many of these factors across the essays, with tobacco use, lack of screening, cultural influence, healthcare access, poor diet, and coal being the most frequently mentioned risk or contributing factor. And again, as you can see, participants identified a range of issues, of which many align with key social determinants of health that are known issues in Appalachia and that are known to contribute to the high rates of cancer in the region. Importantly, our participants suggested a range of solutions to lower the cancer rates in the area, including increased cancer education, increased cancer screenings, tobacco control, and better healthcare access and healthcare engagement. Many of our students are interested in using what they've learned in the action program and through writing these essays to take action in their families and communities and to implement solutions that could aid in reducing the cancer burden in the area. I personally find it very interesting that cancer education was referenced over 40 times. Action participants are passionate about their perception of the power that enhanced cancer literacy can have on their families and communities. Anecdotally, in interacting with these youth, I believe that this is in part driven by the fact that most of our students receive little to no cancer education themselves prior to their participation in the action program. But now they see how powerful cancer education can be. In conclusion, using storytelling, we've empowered youth in Appalachian, Kentucky to understand cancer through their personal experiences and their cultural framework. Youth learn that their experiences and those of others tell a more powerful message about cancer than do the statistics alone. Our participants better understand cancer's impact now, and they have envisioned culturally tailored community-based intervention strategies that could aid in reducing the cancer burden in the area. Ultimately, using such a storytelling approach, I believe, can help individuals better understand a complex topic like cancer through their own cultural framework. Finally, I'd like to thank my collaborators on this project, Lauren Collette and Lauren Hudson, both of which are UK undergraduates, Chris Pritchard, who's the Action Program Coordinator, and we really thank our funding sources, including the National Cancer Institute that funds the Action Program, and the University of Kentucky partners, including the Markey Cancer Center, the Office of Undergraduate Research, and the Appalachian Center. Finally, here's a list of references that you can check out if you'd like more information on anything that I discussed today. And lastly, I thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to answering any questions that you may have during the live Q&A session. Thank you.
Building resilience through connecting with ourselves and others. I'm Tanya Gully, Professor of Nursing at the University of Pikeville, and this is Sister Bernie Kinney of the Medical Missionaries of Mary, and we want to talk to you today about resilience. At the end of this presentation, we want you to be able to define resilience, explain health implications for resilience, develop ways to enhance personal resilience, and support others who want to become more resilient. Resilience is the ability to confront an adverse event and be able to adapt and maintain functional capacity. An adverse event can include the loss of a job, loss of a family member, or the illness of a family member or yourself. And of course, COVID isolation measures are adverse events. Sister Bernie and I have been nurses for together greater than 40 years. I have been a nurse for 28 years and Bernie much longer than that. We've been in Central Appalachia. I have been here my entire life and Bernie's been here for 40 plus years. We have models of resilience that we can talk about. Me personally, I know my mother was very resilient. One of the things I remember her saying is you've got to learn to make do with what you have.
My neighbor always holds on to parts and puts them in a unique filing system where he can lay a hand on it better than Amazon delivery.
So one way to measure resilience is by the brief resilience scale. This is a 6-item scale, and we would like everyone to develop your own score of resilience that we'll talk about at the end of the presentation. The first item in the brief resilience scale is I tend to bounce back quickly after hard times. If you agree with that statement, give yourself a 4. If you disagree, give yourself a 2. The second item in the brief resilience scale is I have a hard time making it through stressful events. If you agree with that statement, give yourself a 2. If you disagree, give yourself a 4. The third item, it does not take me long to recover from a stressful event. If you agree, give yourself a 4. If you disagree, give yourself a 2. Item number 4, it is hard for me to snap back when something bad happens. Agree, give yourself a 2. Disagree, a 4. I usually come through difficult times with little trouble. Agree, give yourself a 4. Disagree, give yourself a 2. The last item, I tend to take a long time to get over setbacks in my life. Agree, give yourself a 2. Disagree, give yourself a 4. So after you score yourself on that resilience scale, just hold that until the end of the presentation. The health implications of resilience. High levels of resilience has been associated with better psychological and treatment-related outcomes for patients with cancer. High levels of resilience has been associated with increased satisfaction in their lives of patients with COPD. Low levels of resilience has been associated with anxiety, depression, and negative thought patterns. Factors associated with resilience. Personal health.
Self-care is very important. Having a routine, getting up early, going to bed early, having enough sleep, enough food of the right choices, refueling by talking with people who energize us, replenish our water. High water keeps us in balance, and having a usual physical exercise pattern, taking the stairs rather than the elevator.
Another factor associated with resilience is self-efficacy and goal setting. These are two different factors. Self-efficacy is the notion that I can do this. I can set goals I have met for myself. Build on small successes. Have a positive view of yourself.
Trust your emotional intelligence. It isn't only what's in the literature that needs to be a resource for us. Trust our gut. Exercise understanding, compassion, being present with the person who is right there, not being daydreaming or anything like that.
Perseverance. Keep pushing forward. Realize that success takes time.
Using our reasonable ability. Emotional, how we feel about things is important, but we need to balance it with rational. What makes it rational for this choice?
Social support and collaboration skills. Foster positive relationships with family, with friends. Avoid competition. Avoid stepping on others' toes.
Prayer, belief in a higher power. It doesn't matter what religious tradition you follow, or even if you have none, but commune with nature. Trust. We have each other. All that we need will be given to us.
Understand your purpose in life. Realize and articulate your purpose. If it's not said, or if you do not own your purpose is lost.
Being with or connecting, it starts with ourselves. Do we know who we are? Being connected inside, connecting with others, connecting with nature, with the sun, with rain, with cold, with heat, with trees, and being connected with history and events. The recent crisis of the government being invaded is a major event in our lives.
There are barriers to connecting with others, especially during this COVID pandemic. Lack of internet was a barrier to connecting. If individuals were technologically deprived or technologically illiterate, that is a barrier to connecting. Lack of social interaction and support is a barrier. During this COVID pandemic, we had a widened socioeconomic gap, especially for people who were unable to have internet service or have the items needed to connect through the internet.
Being intentional, making choices about our personal health, eating nutritious food, not food that just is empty calories, drinking lots of water, getting adequate rest, having a plan to have recreation every day, and physical activity. And if your anxiety gets too much, it's possible to do a brief action called laughing yoga. You release the tension and increase your endorphins. You do it very intentionally. You go, ooh, la, la, loo, la, la, ooh. And you can feel your body relaxing when you have a good laugh. And this has been scientifically proven, and we'll give you the resource.
This helps your mental health by reducing stress, this laughing yoga. Social support is important. Healthy relationships with friends, with family. Families are isolated. A lot of families are playing games, playing board games, playing cards.
Be aware of your core values. Be honest and authentic. Have self-respect. Have respect for those around you. What do you value? Avoid a downward spiral. Reinforce, I've done the best I can. And that builds our self-respect.
Personal health. Daily renewal of energy.
Get rid of the clutter. Clutter leads to chaos, which diffuses our energy. It's wise to arrange your space so that you can get the most done and you feel at peace.
Strengthen natural connections in your neighborhood, in your community. Those natural connections could be your family, your friends, your children's teacher, the nurses at your primary care provider, your neighbors.
Choose to be a conservator of life by awareness of values. Don't just go along. Embrace with energy the life values.
Authentic growth. Transformation needs to be sustainable.
Change for the sake of change is useless. Have an end point when you make a change, and it may be step by step, but honor that.
Honor traditions. Listen to the elderly. They have a lot of stories to tell. They can enrich our lives. Write your own story.
Be enriched by ritual.
When you write your own story, you realize your successes. Share personal history, things you have learned.
Learn how to make do. Learn how to manage. Perspective guides our actions. Adventure and explore new ways. Thrive, not survive. Broaden your circle.
Join a new group. Learn a new skill. We believe the Central Appalachian region is, how do you say, it's
Full of opportunity.
full of opportunity for increasing our resilience. Bird watching is a wonderful opportunity to be mindful, be present in the moment, to watch the birds feeding and interacting with each other. Gardening, vegetable gardening, flower gardening, getting our hands in the dirt.
Hiking, climbing to the top of the mountain. It may take us longer than we'd like, but the successful feeling is worth the effort. Get in shape.
Crocheting and sewing, using the fine motor movements of our fingers, helps keep our brain active. Hunting and fishing, most of our men are the hunters and fishers, so we don't want to leave those folks out. So, your resilience score. At the beginning of the presentation, we talked about the resilience scale, and if you have your score, if you scored from 1 to 2.99, you're low resilience. And hopefully you've learned ways in this presentation that will help you improve your resilience score. 3.0 to 4.3 is normal resilience, and 4.31 to 5 is high resilience. Here's our references, and thank you for letting us present today. Have a good day.
You are resilient. Be healed.
Can everybody hear me okay? I guess so.
We got you.
Okay, awesome. Good morning, everybody. Coming to you live from the Appalachian Center at the University of Kentucky. And my presentation today is called Broadcasting Region, Educational Television via Airplane, and the Beginnings of an Appalachian Communications System. Before I get started, I guess I'd like to say a word of thanks to the conference organizers, noble people who stepped up to the plate in a very difficult and stressful time. So before I get started, I'd just like to say I'm very grateful for the opportunity that we can still have ASA in this environment. I'm a PhD candidate in history here at UK, and this presentation comes from one of the snazzier of my dissertation chapters, which dissertation largely on educational television called Appalachia on the Airwaves, History of Public and Educational Television in the Southern Mountains. And briefly, it's organized between case studies on 2 states that have territories within Appalachia and also outside of it. So previously at ASA, I presented my research on Kentucky's network and a little bit on North Carolina's network. But today is one of the other variety, which were roughly two attempts at a region-specific network covering Appalachia specifically, more or less tied or under the umbrella of the Appalachian Regional Commission. So outline for this chapter is starting on what's called the Midwest Program on Airborne Television Instruction. So that's the airplane that I referred to. It was originally intended for commercial use, multi-state educational television program for the Midwest region. So we'll get to Appalachia a bit after that. But designed to maybe adapt in other disaffected regions within the United States, but also part of many efforts to use educational television to shore up educational quality and resources and outcomes in regions that were struggling. I'll get into why we're not all receiving our television from a series of airplanes flying around the continental United States, but also there's a connection to the Appalachian system, a proposed communication system, so including television and radio, but all non-commercial media through more conventional means, interconnection of facilities, but that was also in the mid-1960s. So just when the ARC was getting its start, it was rejected, so that program never got started. And that latter one, I'll get into this a little bit, but it resembles something more like the PBS and Corporation for Public Broadcasting system that we have today, even though that program never got off the ground in Appalachia. So largely my dissertation focuses on how educational television, like I said, was thought of as a more radical, ambitious program than maybe we think about it today. We think of it as more of a benign educational institution, but back then it was viewed as a more transformative device and something that could, as I show in the case of various Appalachian regions, subregions, and larger region, could improve educational outcomes outside of the traditional means of funding and developing better schools. And this chapter specifically goes into the issue not only of how they can provide it to those regions, but bringing up the issues of authority between, or finding some balance between a centralized educational authority, which both of these networks would have been, and essentially, how do you find the balance between that centralized authority and the virtue of local control in public schools that people value so much? Nobody really wants to be on either end exclusively, so both of these took an attempt at finding a balance in between those two. So what we think of as the Midwest Program on Airborne Television started out as an experiment of the Westinghouse Corporation, first developed in 1948. So this is when America's television industry was just getting its start. And as it seems very straightforward, a aircraft that's been commissioned with broadcaster equipment on board. They're not producing the programs on the airplane, but they're relaying that information through an antenna that's attached to an airplane that is mid-flight in a circular pattern over a given area. They were over Pittsburgh in the first experiment. They were able to reach receivers over 300 miles away. It was originally thought of as a commercial, so for the commercial major networks, which instead operated primarily with relays between individual urban areas. But as they were proposing this, it would eventually, if it had been accepted, it would have really upended the broadcast landscape that the FCC had designed, both with radio and early on in television to that point. And Walter Evans, Westinghouse president, testifies that at this point, the only way that this would be the only way that we know of or have heard of advanced so far that anyone other than in metropolitan or suburban areas would get television, because the way the system was constructed, television stations are concentrated in metropolitan areas of higher population. So rural areas are left out. So Stratavision was denied by the FCC, but the patent stuck around, and about 10 years after that was what you might think of as the heyday of educational television, belief in its ability to transform the school systems in the United States. And so this system was picked up by a researcher named John Ivey, who was working with the Purdue University Research Foundation, secured a very, very large grant from the Ford Foundation to license the Stratavision technology and use it as an educational television project in the Midwest region. 6 states centered on Indiana, but all states in its vicinity. And this is instructional television for primary, secondary schools, and colleges and universities. So it's not what you might think of as public television today. They were exclusively programs for use in the classroom and scheduling those programs according to how they might be used in schools that are participating. So they're mainly trying to find schools in that region that will partner with them so that they can best use those materials and understand them. The big fear in this golden age of educational technology and television was that all these fantastic devices that were coming up, people are worried, teachers are worried that eventually these are going to automate the teacher profession or replace teachers entirely, or defer their sort of autonomous roles into merely that of technicians, just sort of guiding people through various educational technological platforms. So MPATI countered that fear by really trying to design what you might think of as a federalized system where teachers that are in the affected areas of their service have the opportunity to voice their concerns through channels, propose their own course ideas or changes to courses that they were receiving, and also be trained in how to best use them and how to structure their classes around a possible television resource. This is what they referred to in a manual as maximum learning conditions. And this, as I referred to earlier, points to how they thought that it would not only be improving the educational outcomes in the Midwest region, but they would also be adapting this somehow to affect greater transformation in other regions or other places around the world that could use educational technology. And I have to stress that this is a very, very large Ford Foundation grant. They were, as you might guess, you probably still heard them as an underwriting supporter of public television today, but this is the amount of support that they gave to MPATI far away exceeds anything else that they gave to a single local educational channel. This is a very grand experiment that they put a lot of resources in. So Ford Foundation is doing a lot domestically to improve educational television stations, but also using it, not necessarily airplanes, but in various means to improve developing countries. And I found all these large reports about how they're implementing programs in the United Arab Republic, India, Colombia, and Niger in West Africa. So there's a lot of faith in how it can be used. So the difficulties for it, or as I said, why we're not getting our television from airplanes today. The large Ford Foundation grant was a one-time only that would not be renewed as such, so they really needed to find their own way to set up foundation and sustain their own support going forward. So they needed to entice member schools. They needed to promote it as a solid and viable educational resource and promote that through other schools that might consider signing on to it. Even though they know that since this is a regular broadcast channel, essentially, schools, if they wanted to, could receive it for free and not have to pay for that membership license. But they wanted them to incorporate themselves into the system so that they could influence and comment through the appropriate channels on how to keep developing the program. It hinged a lot, or the main obstacle that they had to overcome was to apply for more channels. The airplane could simultaneously broadcast on 6 different channels, but they started out, their FCC license granted them just 2 as a provisional experiment, but they needed to apply for those additional 4 channels. And all of their promises to schools that were going to use it, they said we're going to have 6 channels eventually. So this is just sort of a provisional setup. Eventually, once we have all those channels, we'll be able to fully schedule a program across all primary, secondary, and higher education levels. The biggest obstacle, or that's their big obstacle, but the one that I focus on most in my chapter is they were criticized by the organization called the National Association of Educational Broadcasters. So these are the established names in non-commercial broadcasting, educational television. They've been around since the early days of radio, finding ways mostly through colleges and universities to offer non-commercial options on broadcast media and radio and television. So their criticism of MPATI was that if there's a singular authority, this airplane that sort of corners the market on non-commercial media in a 6-state region, that limits the opportunities for, say, an individual community, maybe in one of those 6-state areas, to start their own operation that they say is more tailored to the specific needs of that local area. And this is where I note a certain irony in this sort of space that the NAEB has between local schools and a centralized authority, because they were themselves, say, a educational television station in one city is criticized as being an overbearing authority over the decisions of local schools. So they're criticized on that level, but then on the other hand, they're criticizing an even larger educational television authority for that same reason. So Appalachia does center on this. It's a slight connection, but one that I think is important between MPATI and this Appalachian program is that there was a lot of faith in educational television to transform regions that were struggling, like the Midwest, like Appalachia. So about this time is when the Appalachian Regional Commission is getting its start, and I have a few documents to suggest that John Wisman, First State's co-chair of the ARC, was approached by MPATI with the opportunity to adapt that airborne system in Appalachia that never was really entertained. More importantly, there was a larger proposal by the National Association of Educational Broadcasters, that more conventional established group, to establish their own regional, what they called communication system. So they incorporated television and radio non-commercial offerings within the Appalachian region. I bring up their proposal. If you start out on it, you're going to see that it's prefaced with very clear textbook Appalachian stereotypes, talking about how the region is closed off from the media and culture from the rest of the United States. So it really, at first glance on it, feels like they're being entirely or generally insensitive to the actual state of education and media or media reading in the Appalachian region. But as I look through this plan, this ideas or the system that they were proposing for use in the Appalachian Regional Commission, it's fairly remarkable and I'd say fairly ambitious. Not as flashy or science fiction-y as an airplane flying over, but is very ambitious and very thorough in what they plan to do throughout Appalachia. So on this map, if you see the sort of stars versus the dots, the stars are educational channels, in educational television channels that had been activated in use. Some of them are in Appalachia. As you can see, a lot of them are just sort of on the borders or around it. And all the dots are channels that were reserved for educational or non-commercial use, but that had not been activated. To activate one of those requires a lot of startup funds, money, just expertise to get a television channel going. So those resources were not really available necessarily in those communities. So what this Appalachia plan offered to do is to, with the ARC, activate all of those unused channels and incorporate them into a network of non-commercial and educational media specifically for that region. And if they're interconnected, so all these television stations and radio stations are activated now, they can work with each other, share expertise, program sharing, so one produced in one state can be used in another, and expand the program variety. So whereas MPATI was all classroom-specific instruction, this system would be after-hours programming, workforce training, and they even pose some interesting programs that I found for their possible more radical application, such as one called the how-tos of setting up a community action program in your neighborhood and community. So if they start off the document with sort of base stereotypes, I think they end it on a much more profound note for what their intention is with this program, which is to say the ARC's communications network, if accepted, should seek to provide the people of Appalachia with all the educational advantages and stimulation which is common to the rest of the country, insofar as it is possible for these media to do this. So really, this is a good statement for my entire project, which is to say that educational television is thought of as an equity asset, something that everybody should have and be able to share equally and fairly within an entire community. So unfortunately, none of these programs last into the 1970s. MPATI, their FCC application for those additional channels was denied. The planes stopped flying in 1968. They still had a lot of programs that they were producing, that they were distributing throughout 1971. And they estimated that as that service went under, there were 13 million students in schools that were using MPATI exclusively for that resource. So their use of those television programs was cut off. And they estimated that 1,000 MPATI schools, MPATI members, were out of range for any other ETV service. So they would have no other option once the airplane stopped flying. And the ARC rejected the Educational Broadcasters Plan in 1966. And again, that irony of localism, they say that even though the system is attempting to incorporate local production and local attention to specific parts of Appalachian communities, they still feel that it's too much of a centralized authority. So they say that program production for educational resources requires a local judgment, and without any, this is a statement of the rejection report's author, without any sort of substantial research into this claim, saying that a state history program from one state, in this case Pennsylvania, would not be as valuable in Eastern Kentucky as they would in another state. So totally denying this regional plan that was the foundation of the ARC anyway. Going forward, the ARC, and it's another chapter, would pick up regional network systems, but this one was denied. Yeah, I think I'm about out of time, so I'll go ahead and stop there. I suppose I could just ask if there are any questions.
Yeah, this can now begin the Q&A portion. So if anyone has any questions for any of the presentations, because I believe that the presenters for the other presentations that were pre-recorded are now in this session. I guess I have one, or sorry, I have one for Tanya and Sister Bernadette. I really appreciated in all those heartfelt things that went along with the resilience test. I don't recall, you said, where have you administered this resiliency test, or what sort of like effects do you think you've seen since, or maybe just in your efforts to promote resiliency? Looks like they were just in the meeting and just dropped out of it.
I have a question for Amanda. I'm not sure if I caught this in your presentation, but how many tweets did you analyze?
I did every 5th tweet for 200 tweets 8 times. So whoever can do fast math, that's how many tweets I did.
Thank you.
I have a question for Carson.
Okay, go ahead, Phyllis.
Oh, you recognize my voice, yes. Did you, what level of schooling were these programs aimed at?
Well, I think in the Midwest program, I didn't see so much
effort towards college and university courses. They did some member schools were smaller colleges, mostly in, I think, Chicago and Milwaukee. So most of their attention was geared towards elementary through high school.
Did you have the ability to see any of these programs? Were any of them saved?
There may be. I was set to visit Purdue's archives this past year, but didn't manage to make it out there. It's kind of in just that worst window of time. But I think eventually I'll be. They have a lot more records on responses from schools and the programs themselves. So.
Well, it'd be interesting to see how you follow up on it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like there's a question in the chat if you are able to see that, Carson. I'm sorry, it looks like it's for Nathan, my bad. So the question is to Nathan. I wonder if Nathan could talk about what the student writers learned about themselves, about their region, about cancer, etc., during the process of drafting their essays. That is from Michael McGill.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for the question. I think, anecdotally, because we didn't really necessarily analyze specifically what you're asking here, but it was interesting to me that many of the students, most of these students are high school students, and we're talking, freshmen, sophomores in high schools, so fairly young, and many of them would initially say, well, I don't know anyone who has cancer. I don't think cancer has really impacted my family. But then going back, and I think, this sort of assignment stimulated them discussing cancer with their family, and they learn more about their family history of cancer and how, friends and family have been impacted. So I think just the sheer nature of them learning more about their family history was a huge win because, in terms of cancer prevention and control, it's really important for us to know our family history of cancer. And then, they certainly learned a lot about some of the causes and consequences of cancer in the area. They explored a lot about tobacco use, environmental factors that they see, sunlight exposure and the lack of people using sunscreen. Those kinds of things were really discussed a lot in the essays. Yeah, I think they learned all those things and they became more motivated, I think, to want to try to help solve the problem and think about ways that they can talk with their friends and family and community to try to lower cancer risk among the people they love.
We have a few minutes for a couple more questions. If anyone wants to ask, you can ask by way of turning on your mic or typing something in the meeting chat. Looks like we have another question in the chat. This one is for you, Carson, here from Zoe Thompson. For Carson, what do you see as the future for these comms programs and infrastructure?
great question. I wish that I could say that I knew anything like that. I mean, I just sort of recognize this as an interesting historical example of what might be a good model for future development in the region, which is to say, I mean, the pandemic exposing how inadequate resources are for educational technology in the region, whereas this appeared to me as something that would really focus on equity and providing the same resources for all communities within the region, urban and rural. So I don't know. I think people would be tempted to say that the broadband cable infrastructure might bring us up to something like this, but I'm just not necessarily convinced myself. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, that'll wrap up today's Concurrent 2. Thank you all for joining us.